and thinking that that would be enough for what you wanted to get, right? Just a symbolic thing, something that again had apostatized itself and that had basically escaped your attitude to go there and make the change, right? All the warrior peoples that inhabited Europe at the time as colonists, as peasants, and they would have lost this idea of the individual transfiguration because they didn't feel enough. They wouldn't self-sacrifice themselves. So the Christians that were very aware because of the religious culture that was imperial also by this time, it had inherited all again, but overlapped since the beginning with the entire celestial religion and the military one, etc. So, of course, these lower connections to this lesser deities, that were very often chthonic deities, not deities of of heaven, but deities of the earth, and or at least also of feminine pre-Indo-European telluric nature, for which these people wouldn't even think their souls would survive and go to heaven, because the only hope for that to happen was self-sacrifice, right? So that was why it was the great shame just to die a coward or unaccomplished for the great conquerors of the past, because it was about the internal struggle it would carry out. These people instead were hopelessly thinking that the dominating gods were the ones of pre-Indo-European world, one of the agricultural cycles, one of nature, would essentially swallow their souls, that would disappear, would roam the world for a while, and then melt away, being reabsorbed by the earth. And so they would not transfigure, would not go to heaven. It's as if there had been two different types of peoples inhabiting the same land since ever. There had always been this kind of equivalent of the celestial heavenly religion being over this superstitious one of the earth. So Christianity had simply substituted to the heavenly imperial culture in the same way, and was looking at these people that what did they do? They practiced magic. Witchcraft, these things were not persecuted by the Christians newly. The Roman Empire persecuted them. The other Indo-European peoples thought they were just less. They didn't tolerate them either, because they were just again for people that had shifted their moral barycenters from outside of themselves and therefore were lost. Here the author doesn't know also what astrology means. Astrology were people who thought that also astrology in the wake of this celestial religion could affect their own lives, but it was a bit the same thing. It was a bit about being affected by the stars and not being responsible for oneself, whereas the Indo-European ruler wanted to become a star himself, as a hero transfigured in the Imperium. And rather it was about reading in the sky the perfection that had to reflect in your own behavior, not being under the stars. So this was also superstition, and it had been also in Roman times. And actually the myth that Christians eliminated astrology from the past is bullshit, because from Europe is bullshit, because in old medieval Europe astrologers were tolerated, perhaps exactly because they had to do with the heavens, right? It's just they didn't have to overstep the biblical teachings. And you find in all the most advanced medieval states in Europe that there were public astrologers next to the priests that watched this, but they were tolerated, because as long as they didn't, again, overstep, that dimension was appreciated. If you pick the average neo-pagan idiot today, say, Christianity eliminated astrology, we were prevented from knowing that. Study history. Stop being a moron and do something with your life. Also the use of amulets, which is another chthonic, dimensional, materialistic, in fact communistic, because again this chthonic Dionysian thing, it's also about communism, it's also about Marxism. That's why in this phase the leftists didn't want you to think, wanted you to feel bad for these people, because they are the same communists of the past. They are the lesser people, the least educated, the poor ones, the least intelligent, the least capable, right? And just content about materiality and don't think about developing their soul as becoming ever more powerful. Do you know what amulet means? There are two possible etymologies. One is from the Latin amolior, which means to keep away, keeping away. So it's the idea, it's not that you have to keep away evil, etc., by being superior to it, because the problem is within you and not having a stupid object making it for you, and so becoming fixated with it and not with your own moral development, right? Or from the Greek amulon, that is a sort of bread loaf that was used to be offered on the altars of the tombs to propitiate the gods and the spirits of the dead, that the latter being the demonic ones that had not transfigured and gone to heaven, and so that you wanted to keep away as a dark force, or also these gods being not necessarily the heavenly ones, but those that were also connected to this darker agrarian cycles and so on. So in other ways, amulets being another symbol of that chthonic Dionysian dimension, and this imbecile professor, of course, doesn't know anything of this, the Apollinian, the Dionysian. It's all about the terrible Christians that are discriminating against cults that were discriminated against even before the Christians, and there are actual laws. The superstitiones, the illicit cults were properly part of the Roman administration, right, and more, and were kept in this time as well, because the average Germanic warrior would think exactly the same. What's an amulet? Right? There could be interesting overlappings of this. I mean, of course, also materiality represented the same power of the people, as we've seen, but it was a proof of their power, not the source of their power. And even though, again, there could be, you could be 10% chthonic, being superstitious in part yourself, but that was already a degeneration of the older belief that, in this sense, the Christians actually kept alive as something superior. That says, what are you thinking? Like, are you superstitious? Do you think that life depends on you just sitting here hoping that you will make it like through a Russian roulette without doing anything? Do something. Work. Be productive. Have faith. All concepts existed in all the traditional religion, the heavenly one, dominating the world. The one of the elites that had always done something, that had changed the world for real, and that was the objective of it all. The imperium, the imperator, the divinization of the emperor was all about this. The decursio, the idea that the emperor would sublimate and transfigure, like Romulus, like other heroes, also in the pagan traditions, in all the European mythologies. So this author says, in the sermons of Caesarius of Ars, 470, about 542, or in the treatise De Correctione Rusticorum of Martin of Braga, 515, about 580, these authors wish for example, the abolition of the festivals in honor of the divinities and the sacrifices tributed to them. So this, again, I will not make the thing myself. I will try to propitiate God, and I will get something in exchange, but I will not do anything. I mean, yes, I will have provided with this sacrifice, but it's just hoping that this God will be gentle with me, and I will not try to be a god myself and to be a better self and to transfigure to deserve salvation in the heavenly place. No, it's just this superstitious mentality, this constant paranoia and fear to be swallowed again by the bowels of the earth and disappear, right? And also the habit to help rid this by howling the transit of the moon during the eclipse, right? These people were howling like animals. You're not an animal, a human being. And you say, but Schwerpunkt, you made a video about the beast warriors. Yes, and if you have listened to them, you perfectly know that the beast warrior was the initiate, was the inept, was the youngest. When you became powerful and greater, you had to have elevated yourself completely from this chthonic, beast-like dimension, and not only humanized but sublimized into divinity. So howling to the moon, which is also typically a chthonic feminine symbol that the Telluric tradition as well, is not exactly what you would think like to be a dignified, divine-like human reality. Right? It's not cool that people howl to the moon. Like the average person today would say, the pagans had this secret knowledge and behavior. No, they were just, in this case, in this type of paganism, this type of people, this type of crowd and vulgus and, again, lower part of the community would be just a bunch of superstitious, irrational, irresolute individuals, just like the ones today that do not make any effort to learn history seriously and to think this bullshit. That's the point. Then the sources say not to frequent magicians, which is interesting because magic was in theory believed to work for everyone, including through the transfiguration. But here you see there are wizards that people go to here, so they give power to these people. They're not elevating themselves, they're giving power to others. Christianity was preserving the heavenly religion. To make vows to the trees and praying the springs. So not saying, okay, well, this tree maybe looks like the Yggdrasil / Irminsul, I will consider it. No, you will make a vow. Right, and of course that's deep, that's important. As you know, the trees were seen also in the Vodanic tradition, exactly like the cross. That's where Odin had hanged himself to acquire higher wisdom. But again, it's still, let's say, a primitive phase in that process of transcendence that would bring to perfection. Trees existed everywhere. The oak, for example, in the Germanic tradition, identical in the Roman tradition. It was an oak on Capitol Hill. In the Bible, the oak is sacred tree. Read it. This is universal beliefs, but this tradition says go beyond. Be beyond the world. Be beyond the earth. Praying to the springs, to the waters. Earth and water were the typically chthonic, demonic forces of the somatic physical reality that was to be dominated by the spirit of the heavens, of the skies, according to, again, universal tradition. So here you see, in all of these practices that the Christians are saying should be prohibited, there is not even one, actually, that is hinting at a self-elevating practice of heavenly imperial tradition. They are all chthonic cults, right? And so what this means actually is that, again, the Christians were countering that dimension, as the previous empires had basically done, and exalting, the entire Roman imperial identity is Apollonian, as you know, right? So these are, by the way, as the author points out, complexively exhortations turned towards the same Christian community. That is to say, there was a Uranic element in these people by certain degrees, just that they were telling them, don't forget about that. Think about the broader religion. And what do you think also these people would have understood about Christianity? They couldn't read the Bible, right? So it's not that here what the Christian clergy wanted is that these people to be perfectly theologically schooled and being perfectly aware of all the Trinity, that the process, but these people had never known anything about that. The Arians themselves, as we've seen, not even the king understood practically what Arianism was. Others did, of course. It was a more complex problem. But the average people, it was just about be better, be dignified humans, being more powerful individually. And that's why also the individuality, women, children, Union of the slaves was say you can all be better, you can all improve, right? And this is a victorious idea. It's the idea that you can win evil. That's why Nicaea won, because it was saying basically that God was superior to evil, that it would win over evil, but that there would be first a terrible proof that you had to go through in life anyway. So how far this was from the actual world where, like in the Germanic mythology, where the Asgard would fall and the Asen would be killed, actually it's hard to tell, because nobody wants to leave, as it will have to happen with Satan ruling before the second advent of Christ, according to Christianity. So this is all the more relevant because it shows that these people were not really trying to resist Christianity, right? So what this professor says is actually pointing at what she was saying before, that there wasn't at all actually a pagan backlash. Where was it? She just said there was in the 7th century from rural communities, and then here, like by the 6th century, it says that people were not consciously pagan. One is that they became consciously pagan in the 7th century to just also return Christian immediately, because she doesn't even know what that thing would have allegedly ended, given that in the following centuries there was a massive spread and consolidation of Christianity. So it's ridiculous, right? This person is just a very ignorant person. Then she says, the identifications of behaviors defined as pagan had thus essentially the purpose of defining the identity of the Christian community united to the bishop to a system of loyalty and common values, without counting the didactic entanglement that was traditionally at the base of such admonitions. Well, yes, and what? Right, also the previous cultures had, again, some priests, had some figures that were consulted and people gather around. So you're basically saying that, again, things were like before. And listen to the conclusion finally. So in recent literature, there is thus the tendency to vigorously redimension the entity and the presence of paganism as a coherent religious system. How? Wasn't there a true, willing, self-aware coming back to traditional paganism? Now you say that paganism as a coherent religious system did not exist, right? What's the point with this, right? So you're saying so that paganism was less than Christianity, basically, because if you say that this thing was not really a religion, and so something that could be counterposed to Christianity, you're basically saying again that this system was less developed and therefore kind of incoherent. You're literally saying this in these words. So isn't this like a denial of what you just said up to now, right? Are you maybe discovering that or what you said is a lot of garbage, and you're coming to terms with that? You just want to leave the reader with some more positive note, so that they hopefully will not be angry at all the rubbish that you've wrote. So there is also the tendency to rediscuss, consequently, the character or radical annihilation of the previous creeds attributed usually by the action of evangelization. They believed in the same things, and to the monastic missions in particular. Of course, there were people were keeping, say, to make pagan kind of rites, like even in the 20th century, in first world, Western countries, you had practices that you can't say, well, this dates back to the ancient cults of the Bronze Age, and they always existed in parallel with Christianity. Strange magic practices, superstitions, etc. Yeah, and so, right? It's again the coexistence of good and evil, of that uranic and chthonic dimension that it exists according to all those religions within us. Christianity believes in it, good and evil, the angel and the devil, that are basically the same destiny that your soul can choose to actually can choose to be, but more than a destiny. You can transfigure if you want. The same thing that pagans believed. So it's a universal idea. It's how we reason scientifically, morally, just to make the world work, right? So, and then it says that Christianity probably didn't have to be implanted ex novo, not even in the northern region posed at the periphery of the empire. Well, yeah, like there were entire countries that Christianized themselves without, just with, yes, external missionaries, but without anybody conquering them. Think about Ireland, think about Scandinavia. And they helped evangelizing all the other peoples around. Also because they had often, especially the Irish, think about the Anglo-Saxons and eventually the Anglo-Saxon mission, because they were closer to that pagan mindset. They had means to make people understand that. I made a video about that as Celtic, spirituality at the root of Western civilization in that process. So is this a surprise? I have texts that say it way before you here, and lots of people knew that. You're not special, you're not new, it's not strange, it's just completely misframed and twisted to make fit a narrative that doesn't have even a sense, but that wants to present Christianity as shit. And that's what you want. And you're just demonstrating the opposite, that you are shit. And full of it, because this is all what you wrote, that proves at every single example that it's not the case. For anybody who scratches just behind the surface or just reads what you're supposed to what is supposed to be your logic, right? And then it says the action carried out by the ecclesiastics were rather dictated by the political and doctrinary need, manifested with all its force starting from the half of the 8th century. What about the Gregorian mission? Starting from the mid of the 8th century, well, started to manifest in all its intensity. Well, let's assume it was the greatest intensity. Well, also later on, the intensity increased, but also by the 6th century was not bad. By the 7th century was not bad. Right, to unify and uniform the religious practice spread within the Roman world by modulating and scanning the rhythm of human life through a cycle of rituals, of prayers, of ceremonies that appeared correct because approved and controlled by the same ecclesiastics, that is to say what all the pagan priests did. Look at the colonization of Iceland, how it happened. What did the pagan priests do? Right, to prevent people, and everybody depended on their decision, just like in the Roman world, in the Greek world, and beyond. What's new about this? And also, this is what this person maybe here in the last line is trying to say. He says that there was an homogenization of these practices within the Roman world in the 8th century. This person is confused, like that was not a Roman world, it was a Romano-Germanic world. And mostly what happened starting from the 8th century was actually evangelization towards peoples that, yes, also say an improvement of Christian culture among peoples that had remained barely Christian. I said it all the time in my videos, but still so, and mostly against other peoples that were not Christian, like the Saxons. So the 8th century is a moment of greater revival of European civilization. Polities were more powerful, even the pagan ones. But, of course, the greater power wanted to uniform its own government, its own administration, and the church served that purpose, hence been serving it throughout all the centuries covered today, like the 6th, the 7th. It accelerated in the 8th, well, thanks to my eyes. And so, like, what's the point, right? That there was you before you said that there was a pagan backlash in the 7th century, then now you say that these people managed to convert some areas that had were also peripheral, because there were Christians even before the missionaries of the church, and who were they anyway, had arrived. This is a series of complete delusional talk. Like a medieval historian doesn't talk like this, doesn't mix up things like this, doesn't reason so confusedly, so disorderly, and simply would like to write a better essay. This is like a mess written mostly by a sophomore. Nothing. This is not what a professor should be writing. It's grossly imprecise, unreferenced, unsourced. It literally invents entire chunks of history, wants to force certain dynamics, ignores basically in a essay dedicated to history of religion the actual religious doctrinal theological issues, probably the spiritual depth of these cultures and how they interacted, wants to categorize what Romans, Germans, Christians, pagans actually were, contradicts itself, quotes literally phrases that do not fit actually the narrative that she's talking about. She claims that there's been some kind of a terrible historiography that has precluded us up to the 2000s to know about these topics that are, again, to be read in any manual written before those times, in the 20th century at least, but even before, by saying that it's coming now to see differently topics that before had been ignored, which is not true, and surprise, surprise, it's just in the last years that people found out these things. It's not true even. So this is total rubbish, and frankly, even the example of the Vandals that said, they began to mint coins with the emperors. What is that? Like, everybody did this. Like, all the Germanic rulers at some point did this. When they settled in the Roman lands for a while, they properly misconceiving the idea of, being able to reason again in differentiating absolute and relative terms, and it's basically just a constant attack to Christianity, Catholicism, the evangelization, denying its success and its improvements civilizationally, even in front of evidence, like just broader conditions improved throughout all this time. From the 7th century, it was moment of greatest contraction for reasons also that didn't have to do with Christianity, and then the more Christianity expanded, because it's simply the communities that were Christian expanded and things went better. And yes, the pagan world, generally speaking, was such also because it was less developed, and there was no kind of coming back of paganism that could threaten this process. Everything worked really in inside smoothly because resistance was normal, but Christianity spread anyway, so autonomously. So this is just essentially a Marxistic rant, a pretty misinformed text, frankly, a pretty also poorly written one from a logical point of view, and this is, I think, a very good example of what we mean when we think that Marxism has damaged a great part of our probably of cultural capacity, right? And this is the point, right? Marxism doesn't care about being coherent. It only cares about demolishing humanity, about demolishing what makes humanity great and greater and capable of expanding and strong, and demonizing, confusing, smearing, which is also what it accuses others of doing, also for no reason, frankly, because it's not at this point there was even the examples she provided shows reasons for which Christianity would deserve this thing. And the expansion of Christianity at some point was also violent, but it was for reasons that had to do with the general violence of that world, not particularly because of Christianity. But even the examples that she provides with are actually pretty tenuous, pretty peaceful, pretty actually moderate. Doesn't seem like a big deal. So none of this actually goes towards the direction a person would like. And we are here to expose this. Anyhow, I've lost my voice almost, but I really wanted to make this video because I think it's useful to explain you how bad this can go, and especially I think that my commentary provided you with that tools that you can use when meeting with such superficial and incorrect and anti-scientific historical publications, and what kind of mindset you should enter in to cope with it. Anytime I find this content, which I usually don't because I select carefully my let's say my reds, etc., I will however let you know so we can debunk a bit more of this kind of filthy propaganda again. I didn't know, I read this thing, I said this is complete rubbish. I went looking at the author and I said surely she's a communist, and in fact she teaches, I could even tell you if you want, but you will find who she is, but it's not the point. But again, social justice and gender theory in the Middle Ages and all this bullshit. And this is what this person wrote, and I suspect that what she writes 20 years later now is also much more vicious and disgusting than this poorly presented alleged historical explanation. And always be, this is what the note with which I would like to leave you today is: never lose faith in the value of education. Never think that universities are lost. Never think that there aren't people from within the system that cannot stop this, that studying history or being in the humanities is something wrong or useless, because that's exactly what Marxists want from you. A conservative that says that studying humanities is useless is a Marxist-desized conservative, and it's lost, because without humanities, as without science, and the two things combined, you cannot afford to be a developed human being. You cannot afford to be a citizen, you cannot afford to be a fighter, you cannot afford to be morally dignified. And this is exactly the dehumanizing attempt that these forces of evil will never manage to carry out, because the light will not be obscured by these people, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against us. That much I can assure. Therefore, for today I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.